They are interesting slides, let's say. So thank you for having me, DataBS. I didn't know about this conference at all until very recently via Blue Sky. So if anyone is wondering whether Blue Sky is a viable channel to use, it is. I really enjoy the conversations that are there. I'm more of a passive reader than a participant, I would say, but I create content elsewhere, which we'll get into in a moment. I'm going to be talking about churn prediction, which is how to make butter from cream. Of course, everyone thinks it's really difficult, but it's actually really easy. And no, it's not actually about butter, but it's about people who leave. Very sad thing, but people do actually leave. In the context of a company, it means they stop paying for your services, and we call this churn for some reason. In any case, I'm giving a small motion sensitivity warning. There are moving images in this presentation, so if you are sensitive to that, that is something that you might want to consider on your screen. I don't have a way to not have GIFs in my presentation, unfortunately. Zoom doesn't have an option for disabling motion. So also the hashtag lawyered obligatory stuff, because I am talking about things that did happen with possibly former employers, possibly not. Things that have been obscured are marked as such so that it doesn't seem out of context. I cannot prevent myself from putting GIFs in the presentation. It's very true. So let's talk about who I am. I'm largely unknown, and it's okay that way, but I feel like a little bit of context might be useful. The word propensity scoring is kind of important. Talk about what we did, why we initially failed, and then, well, the key takeaways as usual, and then we will have more than 5 minutes for discussion and QA, maybe, hopefully. And so let's start with who I am. I call myself a decision engineer, which you may have seen if you've seen my profile before. It basically means I help people make better decisions. Sometimes we use data, sometimes we don't. It really depends, because that's how every good answer should start with. It depends. I am Swiss Canadian. I live in Switzerland, but I have grown up in both countries. I studied international hospitality management, which basically taught me that customers are very important and you should treat everyone like a customer. And that's how I approach data work. Everybody is a customer. I've been in data for 10 plus years now. I work full-time for a corporate venture here in Switzerland in the health tech space called Well, which probably none of you have heard of if you have never been to Switzerland or involved yourself in Switzerland, let's say, because we're only for the Swiss market. I am an educator and consultant in my spare time. As you can see from my hoodie, I do live stream on Twitch, although I haven't been live for some time. Due to this situation here, we bought a house and moved to it, which has been a lot of effort. And I am an ex-founder of my own startup in food tech, which is a very important perspective sometimes when approaching problems. I have a very strong problem solution kind of design mindset. In any case, let's talk about churn. Or maybe we should talk about the actual word that we're using here to address the topic of churn, which was propensity scoring. So in a nutshell, as you can see here, this is a nutshell. We're trying to take information from the past to predict some kind of outcome in the future. This is basically the holy grail of analytics, right? Because we want to know what's going to happen. And if we're correct about what's going to happen, then we could do stuff beforehand to kind of capitalize on what's going to happen before it happens. The whole time stuff, we won't get into the time thing today. Now, in the space of data analytics, this is pretty much the holy grail, and it's also the most difficult thing. And it's kind of, this line is actually linear, but the difficulty is not linear. I hope that's very important to understand, and many of you probably know this firsthand, that like descriptive stuff, easily and frequently done. A lot of people do it wrong already. You know, people have like, 30,000 Excel sheets and 30,000 dashboards, and all of them say different numbers. So even in descriptive, where there's already a lot of problems, but as you progress through this chain of, okay, let's start making predictions, and then, actually, let's use those predictions to do things about how we can actually engineer that to happen in the sort of prescriptive. things get so complicated, really, really complicated, and it's subject to a lot of things like data quality, and it's very, very difficult to do. So while this graph is linear, it's not linear in reality. More like hockey stick, inverse hockey stick. So if you want a little visualization of what this could look like, you have all these touch points with a customer. Could be your mom, could be a user, it doesn't really matter. You have all these different touch points. And what you're trying to figure out is what could happen next. And why you want to figure that out is kind of important. So way back, oh, sorry, that was the wrong transition. So the final outcome of what you're trying to figure out is a user or company, entity, parent is X% likely to do something in the next period. You're always predicting for a particular period as well, right? And logically, you probably understand that, but trying to make a prediction over the next 5 years is a lot more difficult than making a prediction for tomorrow. And those of you who are familiar with weather know very much about the storm front accumulation of clouds and how all that stuff works, which is why a lot of radar imagery only goes to like the next 4 hours, because that's very reliable. And so that's basically what we get as an outcome from that. So you can imagine, this is where that transition comes in the trenches, 2017, B2B SaaS fintech. This is not an actual photo. It's actually a Gemini, a Nano Banana one, but it's pretty accurate because it does say Q4 goals, no churn on the whiteboard, and I didn't prompt that. So this is pretty accurate of what things were like back then when I worked at this company. There was very intense competition. There was trying to bring out new features, and there was all this market share problems, and all competing for the same thing. So this is why we did this. Obviously, we had huge acquisition costs. You can understand B2B, you paying a lot of money to try and get people in to the door. At the same time, there was a lot of churn. There were a lot of customers that were saying, oh, actually, I've been using your solution for this amount of time, or I've been using your solution for this amount of time, and now I'm not going to anymore. Now with monthly customers, that's a pretty, I would say, pretty predictable thing that can happen. After all, they're on a monthly plan. A yearly plan gives you a bit more planning time, but it is still a problem. And we had different cohorts that had up to, I would say at the time, about 90% churn, depending on what you looked at. Like a particular discount code that was just pushed as maximum as possible had really, really high churn rates, of course, because those people didn't really want to convert, but just sales really pushed them to. And of course, we had problems by getting data from all of these insights that we were learning, things that the data team were doing, getting them into other systems and actually being able to use them, what we call data ops. In the other data ops term, I know there are people that use data ops to talk about DevOps for data, but that's another thing. Naming is hard. And there were at least 300 more reasons as well that I could come up with, but these were really big ones. So, of course, what it boils down to at the end of the day is we want to save money. A lot of people in this scenario would have said, oh, this is a great way to make money. Well, actually, no, we're trying to save money, which, okay, I guess from a EBITDA perspective, it sort of makes you money. But anyway, we're trying to save money. So what did we do first? We went data hunting. Everyone loves a good data hunt. We tried to figure out what do we have and what can we use for our experiment. There was all this customer support data around. There were tickets and NPS responses and a lot of qualitative answers of people complaining about stuff or people requesting things, all that kind of stuff. Then we had all of our subscription data. Obviously, we had the trial stuff about when they started. We had things about when they purchased a plan. We had obviously churn dates, all the plan information itself. We had all the financial data apart from that. So we had which type of package they were on, what type of pricing model they were on, whether they had discounts or not. And you have to understand that our pricing model had changed several times up to that point. This wasn't like, oh, we've got 3 plans, basic, pro, pro plus. This is Apple level pricing where there's price changes every 6 months, plan changes every 3 months. It was very, very complicated. We also had a huge silo of behavioral data. Those of you who are familiar with kind of product analytics, you know that capturing all of this movement within your product is really, really important, especially in the SaaS context, but in general. So we had login records, we had usage of specific modules, we had a very, very granular level of tracking, and that was largely due to a concept that I championed in the beginning when joining the company. And we had some stuff that was regulatory because we were a B2B SaaS fintech. So there were some like financial stuff around about, okay, these customers don't conform to this type of accounting structure, blah, blah, blah. Which, yeah, I say blah, blah, blah because it's pretty boring for me. Obviously, some people are excited by that, but not me. And of course, then that wasn't enough. We said, this seems like it's not enough data. Let's see what else we can find. We had third-party data that we could get about these companies, because don't forget, in B2B context, you have all these corporate entities, and these corporate entities are being researched, particularly in a small country like Switzerland that only has, I don't know, give or take million and a half companies. That is quite interesting to look at, because there's people calling around doing market research, getting, how likely they are to go bankrupt and how many employees they have and what the CEO did beforehand, all this kind of stuff. We also had weather, because someone suggested that we pull weather data because it may be linked to churn. I will not name that person. It may have been me, maybe not. And then we had lots of public data as well. We had census records. We had income statistics by area. Don't forget, Switzerland is a small place. There's only 5,500 postal codes here. You can get very quickly breakdowns by postal code, which companies are in those postal codes, right? So we thought, this sounds like a great idea. This is just a really impressive slide. I wanted you to see an impressive slide today. If you didn't like any other slides, this is the one that is very impressive. So after gathering all this data, we had problems, as you can imagine. We had technical issues. We had what we call dirty data, which obviously at a conference like this, I don't need to like blur these terms out. We had shit in, shit out. It's very simple. We had lots of implicit data. If you've worked with weather data before, or you've worked with sales data, right, you'll realize that, for example, people don't like to buy software on a weekend. I wonder why that is. Oh, it's because they're not working on the weekend, right? They're not buying your software on a weekend because they're not working on the weekend. So when your model goes, hey, day of the week, whether it's a weekday or a weekend, is super significant. Yes, it's significant because it is that way, right? Just like people only buy umbrellas on rainy days. This is just how it is, right? And if you don't know this, then you can run into a trap. So we had this. We also had hidden data, which I will get to in a moment, but there's, columns like business risk, and you don't really understand what that means. So we had kind of this scenario, which is basically just potato making potato. And that wasn't enough. We also had problems on the business side. Because you have to understand, this was already well into 2 to 3 months into this project. And people were questioning our resources. They're saying, you're doing all of this data discovery. We haven't seen anything yet about this project. Why are you using machine learning? This was not, fortunately, this was not the AI race yet. So we couldn't get away, or unfortunately rather, we couldn't get away with saying, oh, we're doing AI yet. But we had machine learning fundamentals there, but of course the business doesn't really understand what machine learning was yet. Maybe they still don't. And then of course the question started to arise, how are we going to integrate this into the business, how they actually do business day to day? And that is a very important thing to keep in mind, this particular part. So let's talk about context. Context is really important. We had fields called financial risk or business risk. And there were, variations of like low, medium, high, very high. And of course, we were trying to use this in our machine learning. And for the life of us, we just couldn't understand what it was doing. And this is the problem, is that when you use a column like that, there's no metadata, nobody knows where it comes from. You have it from a data source. In this case, it was from our Zendesk instance. What kind of risk is it describing in the first place? Risk for whom, right? Financial risk for us or for the customer? Because financial risk low on a customer record could mean, well, there's low risk that they go bankrupt, which is good for us because that's low risk. But what if the risk is high? Like, just, we had a lot of problems of context. And this was one of the things that I try to instill in people is like, if you use all of this data from somewhere, it's great that you use it, but you also need to understand what the data is in the first place. So let's do some more feature engineering. Obviously, once we figured out which fields we kind of understand, we started to do more feature engineering. And of course, we found out what dimension is the most impactful on our machine learning model. After 3 months of XGBoost fueled pizza induced coma, it became quite clear that the logins within the last 63 days, asterisk, X days, were very significant for the model. And that's because customers have to log in to cancel their subscription, and then they don't log in anymore. Yeah. So that was pretty much a fail. Because at that point, we realized all we had done is engineered the thing that we knew from the beginning in 3 months. Machine learning is not the same as data ops. Just because you have a model somewhere, just because you have this output and you know that this is very significant, this is not the same thing as being able to put something into a process. So we had to bring the data where it matters. And so the problem that I identified at the time was, well, customers log in to cancel their subscription, which usually happens 2 to 3 months before the end of the period, especially on a yearly subscription. Right? Whatever was determined by this model. And so our solution was very simple. I built a little code snippet in Google Tag Manager that detects when a customer enters the churn process. The second stage, not like the first stage. Like they really, they mean to do it. It was a multi-stage process. And it would fire a Slack webhook. And this webhook would go into a channel for the customer success team, and they would call the customer for a check-in. Now, I use the term check-in loosely because we all know it's not a check-in. We all know that that call was destined for something else. But for the customer, it was a check-in. I am curious whether anyone can guess what the impact of this was on churn. I'm reading chat here with a side eye. Now, I will share the actual number because it's, if you don't know the revenues and stuff, it's fine. It's okay. And it's very funny because I'll give you an anecdote. Every single customer, they would receive this call. And I tell you, every single one, I would listen in on a couple of them. Every single customer was the same. Oh, that's so funny. I'm actually in your software right now. That's so great that you're calling. I actually want to tell you why it's not meeting my needs or why I have this problem. And they would start complaining, right? And the customer success person is like super trained on this. So they know exactly how to respond. They have like all these kind of semi-script stuff, right? And honestly, in 81% of those cases, we were able to reduce churn for people who were called and reached, obviously. It was, I would say, asterisks because it's not 81% globally over all the customers, of course, because we couldn't reach all of them. But it worked. It worked very well. It saved the company a lot of money. And it took about 30 minutes to build this in Google Tag Manager. So what did we learn from this? Well, the first thing is you need a goal from the start. If you don't have this goal, we had a goal, right? But we just started technical work before we had really understood what that goal is. Okay, we want to reduce churn, but how would we actually do that? If we found out who was likely to churn, how would we go about doing that? We didn't have that. We didn't involve any stakeholders. You might say, that's great, because the data team doesn't need to involve stakeholders in machine learning work. And I say, if you don't know what financial risk means as a column, and you find out 3 months later after this project has completed, when you make an offhand comment and the head of customer success says, oh, financial risk, we implemented that for this, and this it means that. when you don't involve stakeholders, that's exactly what happens, is that you don't understand things and you're sitting on the sidelines and you're just kind of a chef in the kitchen, and people are throwing orders over to you and you have no idea, no idea who the customer is. So you need to involve stakeholders in data discovery, and definitely first results as well. It's non-negotiable. Whether you involve them in the sort of tailoring of the process part is maybe situational. And the third thing is that whether you make a model or not, in our case, we did have a model, but we learned the same thing that we could have learned otherwise. The operational aspect determines whether that model just stays somewhere and kind of dies on your computer, or whether it actually lives and has a chance to thrive and be updated continuously and, actually have impact. But really what affected me the most was this bonus thing, which is root cause analysis. That if you understand why something is occurring, how you get there being irrelevant, if you understand why something is happening, like we did, you can have a lot more impact on something by just addressing that thing directly, rather than trying to figure out more analytical ways to shine light on the problem from different perspectives. If you know that users need to log in to churn, you don't need to make a model. You can just tackle that head on, which is what we ended up doing. So there is some time for discussion, Q&A things. I guess we're well into time, right?
Oh yeah, we have time.
Excellent.
Yeah, we have 10 minutes, so plenty of time. Uh Also, like the chat was a roller coaster.
Yeah, I'll have to catch up on that later. I couldn't keep pace with everything.
Because you would lead with a thing and we're all like, oh yeah, this is gonna go terrible. And then say it's like, oh, this worked, that worked, or a bunch of other things, which is great. Okay, let's go see if there's any questions. There was someone's asking, what was the hospitality to data work pipeline like? Uh
In
just
terms of career
yeah.
progression, I guess.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's a fun one. I know a lot of people in data who are um, kind of side entering people. Like there's not the classical kind of, I went to school for CS and then into data. So my path is maybe somewhat unique in that respect, but it's definitely within that realm of, oh, I was doing something else and now I want to do data stuff. And for me, the transition was quite clear. I out of university, I started working as a technology manager, which meant do everything that involves a computer for a recruitment company. It was a pretty small company. And that was where I really discovered what metrics mean, because we talked about how many CVs it takes to get someone hired at a position, and all this like contract stuff, and we had loads of dashboards, and we are using a lot of like this CRM system. And it was so interesting to me that the CEO, who was extremely data um, attuned person, that they would use data as part of all of their conversations. And they'd say, oh, this quarter we closed this many deals, but the deal average actually went down compared to last quarter. And this just somehow it just unlocked something in my brain as a naturally curious person. And I found out that this whole domain of analytics actually exists. And from that moment on, I was hooked. And so I actually applied to an agency to work as a digital analyst, it was called at the time, which was working with web data, websites, e-commerce stuff. And that's how I really got into the data world. And I guess the really big change for me at some point was discovering what a database is. That's where me and SQL met. And yeah, that's a love story, of course.
Uh, so honestly, I think most data people come from sideways, as you put it. I think I mean I came from like I don't even know how I got into this, just nerdy whatever. Like definitely don't have a CS degree. I know half my colleagues at work are like political science and or neuroscience people, right? And social scientists are like way overrepresented, which is great. But then we have just yeah, I've talked to people who are like, yeah, I used to be a QA engineer, or I used to be customer
Hmm.
service or whatever, and they just see data and they want to do that and they're good with it and they become data people.
One
Uh,
of my colleagues is a physicist. I mean, it's
yeah.
really if you're passionate about something and you want to make the passion your day job, then you can. I think the
Mhm.
motivation is there and the skills just follow afterwards. Yeah.
Yep. Okay, someone actually has a question about data stuff. Okay, how do you think about sequencing model building and descriptive analytics? Here, you didn't end up needing a model, but is it sometimes worth starting there?
So a model can force you to think about things in a different context than just descriptive analytics, right? Because we obviously had descriptive analytics about how long it would take customers, to churn and how many times they logged into their account and stuff like that. But what's interesting about the model building part was obviously attaching a certain significance to a particular dimension was pretty a stark contrast to just sort of seeing a sort of spreadsheet like view of, okay, these customers who've churned and their logins look like this. It's a little bit of a different context. And the other thing as well is that, um, in order to get to the point where we could nail down a particular pattern, we had mathematically engineered a kind of dimension that every customer had their own movement pattern. It's a little bit complicated to explain, but we had a kind of an individualistic regression per customer where it flagged how off path that person's path currently is, how strongly it deviates from it. And it was actually that deviation percentage that led us to the fact that the logins dropped so significantly compared to their previous pattern. But you couldn't just code that. Like, you couldn't just say, okay, show me all customers with this many logins and show me how many don't have that many in the last quarter. Like, that's too simplistic. So we needed the model to also better understand that attribute in the first place. So I think building a model, I don't think you go into a problem saying we should build a model for this. I think it's very situational, and it is worth it a lot of the times to start modeling something, whether it's a formal data model, in the sense of, you're just making a good schema and understanding the data better, or an actual linear regression or XGBoost, predictive, whatever kind of model you end up doing. I think it is worth it a lot of the times, purely in terms of thinking structures. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of us have done variations of churn models, and the collective wisdom is that, yeah, if you're out to make a churn model, you're usually going to fail, right?
Yeah,
It doesn't mean that it's not worth doing. You usually learn something in building the model, right? That may point you in a different direction, or may point you to actually the correct answer. But like the model itself usually doesn't is not very predictive. It is usually a giant pain in the butt to put together.
that's right. And in this case, I did follow up with the team. I left shortly afterwards, for completely different reasons, but I followed up with the team a little bit later, and actually they did put a model into production, which was a variation of the one that we had built. And it was, syncing to Salesforce, and they would use that data automatically in Salesforce for both customer success, but also, for sales for their regular checkups. Because it got to the point where the model was very good at identifying customer churn before customers started the process. So it started to flag customers as a kind of health score, and then when their score would drop, the regular salespeople would actually reach out to their their pool of customers, and they'd reach out to them and say, hey, how's everything going? And that took a lot of load off the customer success team as well.
Oh wow, that's
Yeah.
cool. Yeah. Anyone got any other interesting questions here? There are a lot of people discussing their different degrees
Hmm.
in chat right now,
I see that. Yeah.
which is really cool. Data journalism, physics, applied math, anthropology, neuroscience. I mean, everything. Um, if anything, there's no like the word data doesn't appear in any degrees. I mean that those programs only existed for like a couple of years at this point. So,
Yeah.
okay.
It's one
So
of
one
yeah.
years. Go ahead.
This is one of the main reasons why I started educating, because back when I got into the data world, I basically just had mentors. There were no
Mhm.
programs. There was very, very little in the way of formal education in that sense. Now there are more degrees and things like that, but every educational institute is always lagging. I mean,
Yeah.
I teach applied AI use cases where we have a kind of pattern approach, and every every month I text with my other professor, and I'm like, should we update this? Should we update that? It's really, everything is changing so quickly, and it's really
Mhm.
difficult to, because we have to put some of those changes have to go through a kind of peer review process, of course, so we can't just change
Mhm.
slides willy nilly. And yeah, it's quite lagging. So it's useful to have other avenues of education that are more up to date, I would say.
Definitely.
Yeah.
All right, so someone has a question here. You mentioned the per customer behavior patterns. Did you see segments of similar customers, or was it always specific to that particular customer and the segments themselves weren't useful?
That was the number one question that came up from our COO at the time. And I was really, really happy that there were segments. There were very useful ones. We, as a software company, largely targeted SMEs. And if you know about how SMEs work, obviously like the really really big companies, they move very slowly, so there's very little pattern change in, for example, their usage of software. Like if you look at how Salesforce uses Oracle, for example, you probably won't see anything on company level. But because SMEs are so small, if one person stops doing something, it's immediately flagged. And what's really interesting is that SMEs have things like seasonality, where some of them only work in the summer, some of them only work in the winter, or their business is seasonal because they repair bicycles and no one's repairing their bicycle in the summer because they're using it. All this kind of stuff. And there's other reasons for segmentation as well, like people who operate in a particular type of business have different types of fiscal years and all this kind of thing. And so it was really interesting to see kind of the baseline segmentation that we did have already to some extent manifest itself in the model as well, and be like, oh yeah, so all of these customers that actually churned at that time, like 70% of them are in this cluster. And we actually used a bit of k-means there to actually put them kind of together because they had very differing properties, but they all had similar behaviors. And we were able to extrapolate that to new customers then, because when we would acquire a new customer, they would get flagged into these kind of loose segments rather than having to hard code every single type of business. We would just segment them into these clusters. So that
Oh,
was
that's
very
really
useful.
cool.
Yeah, that was very useful.
Cool.
Naming the segments was the most difficult.
Yeah, usually you're just like, there's a bunch of people that do this thing. I don't know what
This
to
is
call them.
blue. What are
Yeah,
their
the blue
properties? Okay,
cluster.
their average spend is this, and their average plan is that. It's a bit difficult to
Hmm,
sometimes name them,
hmm, hmm.
but we did
But
come
at
up
least
with
they were
great frames.
meaningful. Like I've stared at
Yeah.
so many cluster segmentation things, and you're just like, yep, the bunch of people that do this, but it has no practical
Yeah, that's
application.
that's actually the situation I'm in with my current work, is that our platform is basically for everyone in the country. So when you look at
Oh yeah,
user based segmentation, is useless. It's
yeah,
basically everyone in the country. So you have a subset of everyone in the country, which is, there's no segmentation you can do for that really. Yeah.
yeah, yep, 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 yep. All right, we are at wait, we have time. Yeah, we're at our time, but thank you so much. This was really
Thank
cool.
you.
Go catch up on chat. There's a lot of things going
I
on
will
there.
catch up on chat. I'll hang around as much as I can.
All